So I want to welcome you to this meeting of the Sudbury Historical Society. As you know, we are a nonprofit private corporation that is funded solely by memberships, donations, sales, and maybe even grants sometime. So we encourage you to remember the society when you want to buy a book or when you want to learn about your town. And it is our mission to make the history of Sudbury come alive for its people. And let me tell you, after having been in the Seattle area, we've got history that we can be proud of. And it's interesting besides. So we are very, very lucky to be able to preserve and bring forward for people the history of Sudbury. Now, the Sudbury person, we like to claim him, who's going to be brought forward for your information today, is very special. And Ursula, do you want to tell about our presenter and our topic?
Thanks, Peg. Thank you. Yes, thank you, Peg. I just want to welcome you again on this very bizarre type weather day, and I'm so delighted that you could come. Before I begin about Ralph Adams Cram, I just want to let you know next month we are having Stuart Whitehurst from Skinner's coming, and he's going to do a verbal appraisal of any unusual antique that you may have. So please come Sunday, March 9th, but we need your reservation ahead of time if you can call and let us know you're coming, because there is a limit of 40 items. March 9th at 2 p.m. here. Okay. Ralph Adams Cram, as most of you already know, had his summer house up the street in Whitehall. And I had hoped the owners, the current owners, would be here, but they may come later. He had quite a visible presence in Sudbury when he was here, mostly summers. Just two things I wanted to point out. As you walk in Town Hall, there's a portico and a lantern hanging above that was given to the town, the original Town Hall, by the Goodman Society. Now, Ralph Adams Cram was a very active member of the Goodman Society, which in turn became the Sudbury Historical Society. So when you have a chance, when you go out, look up there and you'll see some special design and the Goodman Society logo. Also, I'd like to thank Lynn McLean for braving the weather and coming over here with a wonderful painting. It's one of my favorites that is in the Hosmer House. And it's Mary Cram, Ralph Adams Cram's daughter. And when you have a chance later, you can look at it a little more closely. Now, I'm so pleased that after many months of planning, we had to change the schedule because of voting, but we're here, and you are. That Ethan Anthony, who luckily doesn't live too far from here, has come over to tell us about his book. 5 years ago, some of you may have been here when we had the crowd at the library, and Ethan talked about his soon-to-be published book. Well, it took a little longer than we thought, and it was published in April, and we do have copies available. We've already sold 21 copies. We have 9 copies left in our collection now. But if you would like to order, we have an order form back there. Ethan Anthony has quite an extensive resume in his own right as an architect, and I'm not going to read the whole resume, but I just wanted to give you a few snippets about his background. He was born actually in Iowa City, Iowa, and spent his youth in Stowe, Massachusetts. Graduated from Xavier High School in Concord and attended Regis College in Denver and the BAC School of Architecture from 1970 to 1977. And he did study under very well-known architects at that time, and also studied painting. Now, when he graduated, he returned to Boston and worked for the firm of Thomas Payette until 1983. And then he began his own practice in 1983 as Anthony Associates on Congress Street. And that went until 1990, and when he merged Anthony Associates with Hoyle, Doran, and Berry, which is the successor firm to Cram and Ferguson. So from 1991 to 1996, Mr. Anthony and his partner, David Houlihan, completed many projects for various groups, the MCI Telecommunications Corporation among them, all over the eastern coast, and had other numerous clients. When Mr. Houlihan left the company, Mr. Anthony continued the firm. He changed the name to HDB / Cram and Ferguson to reflect the origins and tradition that he was reasserting in the practice. And by 2000, 90% of the workload was church or academic related, similar to Ralph Adams Cram. And he has done numerous works all over the country in academic buildings. He's restored historically significant buildings. And I have been privileged to see his newsletter, which has been carrying a sort of a step-by-step progress of the, it's called the Scion Abbey in Roanoke, Virginia. And that's just an amazingly beautiful place. It's a Benedictine monastery near Roanoke. He's done many others: Phillips Chapel in North Carolina, Our Lady of Walsingham Roman Catholic Church in Houston, Galveston. He's been all over. And he has invested 40 weeks of travel and research in Europe over the last 6 years. So I feel very fortunate that he could fit us into his schedule. He's been called away many times. He's written, as you know, a history of the work of the founder of the firm, Ralph Adams Cram. And he is a frequent speaker on building in Gothic and Romanesque modes and current ecclesiastical and liturgical issues in architecture, among other topics. But we feel very special having him here because of the connection to Sudbury, which Ralph Adams Cram and his family had. And I think he feels it's a special place too. And I'm delighted to finally introduce Ethan Anthony.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ursula. Yeah, Sudbury is really special for so many reasons. You know, it's special to me particularly, I should say, right from the beginning because of St. Elizabeth's, because when I undertook to try to return the firm to what Cram had originally intended it to be, the first real project that I did was at St. Elizabeth's Church, which was a memorial garden which was to be added on to the side of the Cram Chapel. And we were very fortunate to win a prize for that. We won an award, international award, for the design of that project. And I hope someday it'll actually be fully finished. But anyway, thank you all for coming on this day, and thank you for inviting me to speak about Ralph Adams Cram. I am the current principal of the firm, which was founded in 1889. I changed the firm to the name to HDB Cram and Ferguson because of several things. One, spelling Hoyle, Doran, and Berry all the time was a terrible burden, and they were all dead. So, and actually the name of the firm when I came along was Hoyle, Doran, and Berry, formerly Cram and Ferguson, and that was really impossible. So I shortened it down a lot. We are currently engaged, as Ursula mentioned, in the design of the kind of buildings that Cram himself would have been very happy to do, which is, of course, mostly religious buildings, mostly churches and monasteries in the United States, and mostly Gothic and Romanesque work in stone, and very much the kind of work that was done traditionally by the office. It's hard to believe, but it's been 17 years since I started this. But when I arrived in the office, it was actually, at that time, it was just at the end of the 1987 real estate crash, which sounds all too familiar today. Real estate had declined about 25% in value in this area, which I'm sure a lot of you will remember that. And my little fledgling architectural practice declined right along with it. And I remember, letting people go one at a time, slowly, until I was sitting there by myself. And that was a hard thing to do. So I started talking to some friends and business associates, and one of them said, there's this firm, and it's in Copley Square. It's an old firm. It's been around for a long time. They have work, interestingly, because nobody had any work at that time. And the fellow that owns it now just, doesn't have the stomach for running an architectural firm. He just kind of fell into it, and he's looking for some help. So I went over there, and the firm at that time was in a basement office in Copley Square. It was Copley Square, but it was in a basement. When I walked in the door, there were a couple of very aged drafters there. I think they were both probably in their late 80s, and the secretary was 93. And the fellow who owned the firm was the youngest one there, and he had been a project architect and felt a responsibility to the clients to continue the firm when the previous partners retired. So he convinced me that I should throw my lot in with him and try to keep the firm going. And I was, at that time, had really just started to computerize my office. I had lots of computers, and I had AutoCAD and the drawing software, and we were just right up to date on the computerization thing. So I said, fine, I'll bring all my computers over. And I noticed that he didn't have any. I should have made some more impact on me, but so I brought my computers over, and one of the first things I did when I got there is I took one of those computers and I put it on the secretary's desk, Ann Downs, and she said, I quit. So she said she was too old to learn that new computer stuff, and so that was kind of how it went. They all sort of, some of those people did decide to quit at that point. But when I arrived there, I started to spend some time looking through the archives, and at that time, the firm had been, for many years, had done a lot of work for insurance companies, had designed a lot of the major headquarters buildings, including what you know of as the old John Hancock building, the more attractive one, I think. But and Boston University, and much of Princeton, and so on and so on. And I'll get into that in more detail in a minute. But I was really quite unaware of the extent of the work that they had done, and really unaware of Ralph Adams Cram. And that was extraordinary if you think that Ralph Adams Cram was an exact contemporary of Frank Lloyd Wright. And actually, Ralph Adams Cram did more work than Frank Lloyd Wright did. He built more buildings by far in his lifetime, had more projects, had more important commissions by far than Wright had done. Wright did many very interesting commissions. He worked, they were beautiful, undoubtedly, and were for important families at times, but he did many commissions that were modest. And Cram, in contrast, had worked for all of 55 of the major universities, colleges, and prep schools across the country, had major buildings in so many places and so many cities, 44 different states. He'd written 26 books. He was on the cover of Time magazine in 1926, one of only 7 architects in the country's history who ever graced the cover of that magazine. So how was it that I didn't know about him, having gone to architecture school where the dean was one of the carvers who worked on his statues, Arcangelo Cassieri. But the last comprehensive book to be published about the firm's work had been published in 1929 by the AIA. So somehow, Cram had been forgotten. And his friends even eulogized him in the newspapers as the forgotten man, because he had been such a power at a time and had gone so far into this ignominy. I started spending time in the library. The Boston Public Library has a large portion of the Cram work in what is called the Cram collection. They have several notable architects, including Peabody and Stearns and McGinnis, also drawings in that collection, and you can go there and actually look at the drawings. It's very interesting. So I started looking at the drawings and looking at, we had a collection of about 10,000 photographs of all of the projects that had been done, and so much other stuff still remained. It was an antiquarian exercise, actually, for me, because I was unaware of it. It was an antique, and I was fascinated. In 1997, I was approached by W.W. Norton, the publisher, to use a photograph that we had the rights to in a book that they were publishing that had a single little page, one-page section on Ralph Adams Cram, and it was actually a photograph about American writers, not even about American architects. And I had been studying the Cram stuff enough at that point that I just had the temerity to ask the editorial assistant, gee, do you think you'd be interested in a book on Ralph Adams Cram? And, you know, they said, well, you know, maybe. So I got in touch with the editor through this editorial assistant, and she said, why don't you, make a proposal about it? And to my absolute amazement, they accepted it. So I really began at that point to do research in earnest. And at that time, the internet was in its infancy. Google had just begun. And one of the things that I did as an intrepid researcher was to use Google, Google Ralph Adams Cram. And actually I got 7 results, so just 7. And anyone who's used Google knows that's really kind of an amazing thing. 7, you're not even 10. There weren't 2 to go to. So today, in preparation for this talk, I Googled Ralph Adams Cram, and I stopped counting at 700. So what's happened? What's happened is, of course, the internet has grown tremendously over that time period, but part of what's happened is that the people who own and live in and love the Cram buildings have all put stuff about their buildings on the internet. So you can go and look in almost any state and Google Ralph Adams Cram in the state, and you'll find somewhere in that state a building that somebody, it may not even be by Ralph Adams Cram, but people will claim that it is. They're so proud of having any connection to Ralph Adams Cram. So the Sudbury Savant, which was what he was called at one time, has had a tremendous reach for someone who is a forgotten man. So now I will go through. What I plan to do is I have 95 slides. I'm going to go through them quickly because I don't want anyone to get overly tired, but I will answer questions afterwards if you have a question. So please hold your questions until after we get through the slides. Ralph Adams Cram was born in Hampton Falls, New Hampshire, and that is a town that was actually subdivided from Hampton many, many years ago. Hampton was one of the original towns that was established in that area. This is Ralph Adams Cram's birthplace. He was born in 1863, and his name actually is the combination of 2 names that his father had great respect for, Ralph Waldo Emerson and John Quincy Adams. So there is no Adams familial connection in the Ralph Adams Cram, but it is a spiritual connection as it was conceived at the time. This is a photograph of Ralph Adams Cram on his graduation from high school at, I guess, 17 years old, it would have been at the time. To tell you a little bit about the Cram family, to place them in perspective, the Cram name originally was von Cram. They actually came from Germany originally, back in the time of Luther. In fact, he claimed, and no, I don't know if it's really true or not, but he claimed that his ancestors actually marched with Luther. And we do know that his ancestors emigrated from Germany to England around the 1450 or 1500 and lived in England for a time and actually worked and did some service for the monks at Durham and were given a grant of land by the monks in Durham. But the direct ancestors actually lived in a little town called Bilsby in Lincolnshire. And in the year of 1636, there was, of course, a great religious upheaval going on in England at that time and all of the repercussions that followed on the Reformation. And the minister of their church, the rector, was censured and was thrown out of his living for an infraction of one of the 39 Articles by Archbishop Laud. And as a result, Reverend Wheelwright, which was his name, decided to take the entire congregation, and he leased a ship, the HMS Fox, and took them all to the colonies. They left the entire village left as one. And they arrived in Boston in 1637, and when they arrived several months after Reverend Wheelwright's sister, whose name was Anne Hutchinson, had arrived. And Anne Hutchinson is best known for the temerity that she had, which was to decide that she could discuss the Bible with a group of her women friends without a man present. And for that, she was declared a heretic by Governor Winthrop and the General Court of the state of Massachusetts and banished. And they arrived as she had been arrested, and Reverend Wheelwright also was banished for his support of her. He tried to help her, to aid her in the court case, and he was banished as well. Anne Hutchinson, for those of you who don't know her story, actually was forced to walk in the spring. Of course, they waited until spring. They made her walk with her children to Rhode Island, where she joined Roger Williams' community, and for a short time, but she eventually went to Long Island and was killed by the Indians later on after that. Reverend Wheelwright, for his part, left with the remainder of his congregation and moved to Exeter, New Hampshire, where he had bought a small tract of 11,000 acres. 11,000 square miles from the Indians, which included Exeter, New Hampshire, Hampton, New Hampshire, York, Maine, and all of those towns that we now know as that northern part of the southern part of New Hampshire, essentially. They founded the town of Exeter under a grant from King Charles I, and the Cram family, their ancestor, was one of the signatories to the founding of Exeter, New Hampshire. After a short time, the Massachusetts Bay Colony annexed that portion of New Hampshire, of that land. It wasn't called New Hampshire at the time. And so they decided to move on because they couldn't tolerate the Puritans. And they moved to the area that is now Hampton, New Hampshire. And that is where they finally settled, in that house that you saw there. Now, there were 5 or 6 generations between that time and Ralph Adams Cram's birth. And we have, and actually I jumped ahead. I want to tell you a little bit about what happened at his birth. His father, William Cram, grew up as a young man on the farm. His father had a farm there in Hampton, which had been in their family for many generations, and they were well-off farmers. He was their family was well off enough to send him to Phillips Exeter Academy, and should have the next step for any young man in New England at that time who could go to Phillips Exeter would be to go to Harvard. He was unable to go to Harvard because the family had fallen on hard times economically and could not send him. The other thing that happened at that time is he got married to Sarah Blake from the neighboring town, and he decided he was drafted into the Civil War because it was 1863, and his wife was pregnant. He was drafted, and he decided that he could not join the Civil War, even though everyone in that entire area were very strong abolitionists, and actually the Underground Railway had gone through the town, and even the Crams also were a part of that abolitionist tradition, but he could not bring himself to kill in support of any cause. So he became a conscientious objector. This is William Cram. And when he did that, he was thrown in jail. And he was offered the opportunity to pay a substitute, which was the typical thing that people did in those days. And he refused that too in principle, in spite of being entreated by the governor of New Hampshire to change his mind. Finally, it was resolved when his brother paid for the substitute for him without his knowledge while he was in jail, and then he was let out. And he went on then to go to the seminary of Edward Everett Hale in Cambridge and become a minister. And that's how Cram's father became a minister. Cram's childhood was spent mostly in Westford, Massachusetts. The post that his father received that he stayed in for many years was as the minister of the Unitarian Church in Westford. And he was there from the time when Cram was about 3 years old until the end of his sophomore year in high school. So he really grew up in this environment very much like the Sudbury environment and the suburbs of Boston at that time, which were very rural farm towns also at that time. When he attained 17 years, to the age of this photograph, his father did not have the money to send him to college. So his father started to look for an apprenticeship for him, and he initially tried to find an artist to apprentice him to because he had shown some promise in drawing. However, the artist that he approached said, you know, he really doesn't have enough talent to be an artist, so why don't you have him be an architect? So his father dutifully went off and approached William Ware, who was the head of the first school of architecture in the United States at MIT, and also was the son of a Unitarian minister as well. And Ware told him that he would be able to find him an apprenticeship, and he did in the firm of Peabody and Stearns, which was a very young, at that time, just starting firm in Boston. And here we have a picture of Copley Square when Ralph Adams Cram arrived, and Trinity Church. And you will notice that Trinity Church, as it was originally designed by H.H. Richardson, did not have a porch, and the porch is not here. The porch was actually added later after Richardson's death by his successors. But this is the Copley Square that Cram arrived at in about 1881. Cram undertook his apprenticeship with Peabody and Stearns for 5 years. He did stay for the entire 5 years. It was an unpaid apprenticeship. His father had to pay his allowance during the entire time, which was $8 a week. And he chafed under this situation. He was unable to make any money. He very quickly found another way, which was that he became the arts editor of a local Boston newspaper, the Boston Transcript. And he was offered that position after he started writing irate letters about a plan to build an apartment building in front of Trinity Church in the space that was Copley Square. But the work as an arts editor for the transcript paid not very well, and he realized during the time of his apprenticeship that if he wanted to be an architect, he would need to have a European tour. At that time, all well-to-do young people went for a grand European tour, and they would go and spend 6 to 8 months traveling around Europe. They would visit all of the capitals, all of the major cities, go to see the ruins, go to the Forum. You were not considered a well-rounded person until you had done that, and more so in spades for an architect, because an architect was one of the purposes of getting an architect was to have someone who knew about style, knew about particularly European styles, so that when they designed your building, they could design it in a true Roman style or a true Greek style at that time. So Cram decided that in order to get himself a European tour, he needed some money. And the way he chose to do that was by entering competitions, which had cash prizes. And the drawing you see here is his entry for a competition to design an addition to the Massachusetts State House, which was never built, of course, because he didn't win. He won second prize, and second prize was enough to pay for his first European tour. And of course, after 5 years of apprenticeship, he was ready for that, and he quit his job, both his job at the Transcript as the arts editor and his job as the unpaid apprentice, and left for Europe. In Europe, this is a sketch, one of Cram's sketches from his European sketchbooks. He kept many European sketchbooks. He went around, and this one is particularly from one of the ruined abbeys, and I don't recall exactly which abbey it is, but he went around to understand how these monuments have been built, what their dimensions were, and this is he prepared these very careful drawings, because these, of course, would come in very handy later on when he had to start designing at home. He also went to the shrine of St. Francis of Assisi, among many others, but this one is particularly important because he had his first very powerful religious experience that would actually influence him to become very much interested in religion later on. He described in his autobiography going down to the tomb of St. Francis and inexplicably falling to his knees in awe and being overwhelmed with emotion, and what he described as a cathartic experience. He saw many places, many things, many sites on these tours. Another one that was very important was Mont Saint-Michel in France, and this was important to Cram both from a point of view of architecture and from a point of view of his philosophy, because it really shows the distinction between the military aspect of the state and the religious aspect of the state. You see here the church in the center, surrounded by a military fortification. This was the vision of the church and the state that the Gothicists, like Cram, the medievalists, felt was the highest expression, where you had church and state, military and church, together as one entity, but with the church at the highest point, with morality as the core. And that idea really would permeate all of their work from then on. He also visited the ruined abbeys in England and would eventually write a book on ruined abbeys. This one is Whitby Abbey, which was one of the most important and influential sites that he saw. Visiting the abbeys also raised a great interest in Cram in the Reformation. He eventually wrote a book called The Ruined Abbeys of Great Britain, which was a highly inflammatory story of Henry's destruction of the abbeys and of the monastic establishment. And it's a great reading. It's absolutely fantastic. But he really was determined from that point on to restore the monastic ideal in the buildings that he built in the United States and to bring that kind of structure back. This is another one of the sketchbooks, another picture from the sketchbooks, and I include it just because you can see the quality of the drawing that he was capable of doing. If you ever have any question, or if anyone ever says, well, you know, Goodhue was a better draftsman than Cram, well, I'm not so sure. I think Cram was quite a good artist in his own right. When he returned from these European adventures, he owed his father a large amount of money because, of course, the money that he left with was nowhere nearly enough to last for the time that he stayed. And so he started to take small commissions, and this is one of those commissions. It was the design for an interior of a jeweler's shop, and you can see his sign, his signature in the lower left, Ralph Adams Cram, architect. Oh, lower right, sorry. It's not terribly remarkable from any perspective. It was very much the kind of thing that was being done at that time. It's very Victorian in its feel, and you can see, though, the amount of interest that he had in detail, even at that point, in the structure of the columns and the amount of decoration. In 1889, he met another young architect who was also interested in starting a firm and who had some family money. And so the two of them opened the firm of Cram and Wentworth. It was Charles Francis Wentworth, who was a descendant of one of the famous governors of New Hampshire, an early one, an English one. And they were soon joined, within a year, by another young architect named Bertram Grosvenor Goodhue. And in this photograph, you see this is one of the early office photographs. Goodhue is on the left, Cram is behind smoking the pipe, and Jack, the bull terrier, is below. And he's mentioned in Cram's autobiography as well as being an important part of their early office. Goodhue came in at a time when the firm was just beginning, and he had a great capability in doing illustrative drawings. And through the good work of Goodhue doing the drawings and Cram doing the designs, they started to compete for church projects. And the first one they won was, and the most important one, of course, was All Saints Ashmont, which is a very beautiful Episcopal church in the Ashmont section of Dorchester. And it is a very important church to Cram and of course, to New England as well, because it was a church that was endowed by the Peabody family, and they were able to endow it sufficiently that they could build the entire thing exactly as this young medievalist architect wanted to build it, in all of the glory of stone and stained glass and tracery that you see here. There are many important elements that you see in this building that will be repeated in other buildings as time goes on. The tower element, the very powerful West Tower element, was used many times by the firm later on, and also the perpendicular window. And the combination, the interesting combination of many different times. So it was never important to Cram or Goodhue to design a building with everything exactly the right time. So it's quite typical in their buildings to find a perpendicular window next to a early plate tracery window, next to a late decorated tower. I mean, there are many different times will show up in the same building. But All Saints Ashmont was very popular. It was well loved by everyone, and very soon they were getting more work from many prominent people. This is a picture of one of the early houses that Cram designed for the Ide family. This house is no longer there. Actually, I was given this, it was a postcard of the house that was given by one of the descendants of the family. It's really all that remains. There are no photographs even of the house remaining, or very, very few. In 1895, they entered another competition, this time for the design of a congregational church in Exeter, New Hampshire. Cram would have learned about it probably from connections and friends and family who still lived in Exeter, or possibly even from the fact that his father had been at Exeter. And they won this competition, and this is the resulting church. It's called the Phillips Church, and it was originally the second congregational church in Exeter, New Hampshire. And it primarily was attended by people who were faculty and at the academy, and over time the congregational group who had split decided that they wanted to get back together again, so they sold it to the academy, and it became the academy's chapel. It's again one of their very beautiful designs, all in granite. This is the interior of the Phillips Church. I know a lot about this church because we restored it completely about 5 years ago, and this is the interior as it looks today, completely restored. One of the things that Goodhue brought to the firm was the incredible woodwork that you see. And so all of this woodwork, which is based on English woodwork and actually executed by people that were brought over from Germany, from Oberammergau, is a typical interior quality of these churches. I don't think that St. Elizabeth's has any of that woodwork, but most of the larger, more complex churches do. Another local building that you may have the chance to see is the former Nashua Public Library. This was designed by Cram and Goodhue in 1903. It also is in a long process of restoration. It introduced a new style that they had not used before, which was a Tudor brick style, and would become their collegiate Gothic style later on. In 1902, the country was in one of many shocks, financial shocks that had happened, and an envelope arrived in the office mail from the government offering them the opportunity to compete in a competition to design the expansion of the American Military Academy at West Point. And they worked on that competition for almost a year against long odds. All of the other prominent firms who entered the competition were submitting Renaissance-based designs, Beaux-Art designs as we know them, and the Cram firm, Cram and Goodhue, were submitting a Gothic design, which was considered at the time quite radical. And lo and behold, though, they did win, and this is one of the buildings that they built as a result of that competition. This is the post headquarters building, and you can see that it is very strongly based on the idea of the Crusader fort, again, here we have the combination of church and military, with the cadet chapel, which if you've seen is one of the most spectacular churches in the country, I think, is really a beautiful church, primarily designed by Goodhue, but also very much with the Cram firm principles in mind. Now, one of the things that happened with the West Point Commission was the government required the firm to establish an office in New York. And Goodhue had originally been an apprentice in the firm of Renwick in New York, and wanted to go back to New York, was happy to do that. So he was the principal chosen to open the New York office. So they opened this office in 1904 with the design of this church. This was the beginning of the split between Cram and Goodhue. It was a little bit like Lennon and McCartney. They were two individual, very complete individuals on their own, but they had a synergistic relationship that the work that they did was so much better when they worked together that it was quite incredible. All during this time, Cram also returns to Europe quite frequently, and he began, once they won the competition for West Point, they were quite in demand everywhere in the country. It was the most prominent competition in the country. It really established them as a nationally important firm right at that point in 1904. So the money also came with that, of course, and they started to do very well. And Cram began traveling, a habit that he had, which was to take every summer in Europe for almost the rest of his life. As long as he could do it, he went and stayed in Europe for 3 months in the summer, and spent his time, of course, very well. And he did things like one summer he traveled all over England and photographed little churches, and then put out a folio called English Country Churches, which has 115 photographs of churches, many of which no longer exist, have disappeared. But those churches became the basis of a lot of the design work that they did. They took elements from each of them. Another year, he went all around England and photographed the ruined abbeys of Great Britain. And those abbeys at that time were not national treasures. They were in the back 40 of some person who owned them, and they were falling apart. They were literally being taken apart quite often. They were being used as quarries for Victorian follies, in fact, quite frequently. And so Cram started, I think in large measure, started the idea that these were things that needed to be appreciated and should be saved. And he continued to do this work all of his life. And when you said, I was very interested, I didn't realize that he had been a member of the Goodman Society, but that is so in character with what he stood for. He stood for, right from the beginning, and we think of preservation as a relatively recent movement, from the 40s on. Cram was a preservationist in 1904. And he really, in many ways, I think, started the preservation movement in this country. 1905, another project that they did was one of many competitions they entered for cathedrals, and this was an Episcopal cathedral. The Episcopal Church was doing very well at this time. They were building cathedrals all over the country and in Canada as well. This was a competition for the Cathedral of St. John in the Wilderness in Denver. They did not win this particular competition, but it just shows you the quality of the work that they did and how very English the work looks as well, I think. Here we have a postcard that Cram sent back from one of his European tours. This happens to be from Oxford, from Magdalen College. You see his signature in the upper left. Safely arrived after a most perfect voyage, Ralph. So this is being sent back, and I forget who this was sent to, but it was one of a postcard that I found actually in his, where his library is. His library is in a sugar house in Vermont on his granddaughter's land, and is deteriorating, unfortunately. Is really in bad shape, but I did save a few of these postcards. 1907. The Church of St. Thomas's in New York burned, and they held a competition for the architects to design a replacement for the church. This is the competition submission from Cram and Goodhue for that church. And they did win, fortunately, and there ensued a competition between Cram and Ferguson for how the project would be executed throughout the entire time, because Goodhue, of course, was in New York and Cram was in Boston, and Goodhue was in close contact with the project, but Cram was the one that was called always to the building committee meetings. So he would go to the building committee meetings and make decisions and offer things to the building committee, and sometimes Goodhue would not agree with those things. And so they started another habit that they had of submitting competing plans to the building committee. So Cram would submit his plan and Goodhue would submit his unsigned. The building committee didn't know whose it was, but they had to choose. And so in this particular case, the competition was over the interior of St. Thomas's, and Cram won for how the interior was to be developed. In 1909, Cram was appointed as the consulting architect to Princeton University by Woodrow Wilson, who was the president of Princeton at the time. And he stayed in that position for 26 years, designed a number of the major buildings at Princeton, and I have a couple of photographs of them, and was also, as a result of the fact that he was good friends with Wilson, received another commission, which was to design the campus for Rice University. And at the time it was called Rice Institute. And this is the first building for Rice Institute, which is the administration building. It's called Lovett Hall. Yet another completely different eclectic approach. You know, not Gothic, not Romanesque. It has Romanesque elements. It has Venetian Gothic elements. But is really an amalgam of those things. It's a combination of many different influences. This is a picture of a office Christmas party, probably around, I think around 1910 or 12. You see the Christmas tree here, and notably, I would call your attention to the fact of how many women there are in the photograph. There's one. And because there was a tradition at that time, and actually up until the time that I started to work in architecture, very few women worked in architecture. Really, it was our generation that saw some change. It's still only 27% female, actually. So one of the least female of the professional occupations. This is a postcard that Cram sent to his father, William A. Cram. You see the address on the right-hand side. It is a picture of the hotel in France where they spent their summer that year, and I think this was around 1910 as well. Yeah, so this was the year 1910, and you see the Hotel Saint-Jouin, I guess it is, on the left there, and that also is interesting because you see the dormers, and you will see those dormers appear in Cram buildings around right after 1910, which was another interesting thing that happened with him, is that as he made these travels, and it's happened to me too, so I know it's a really easy thing. As he was traveling around, he was influenced by all these things. He did drawings at the time. He was an amateur photographer also, worked in daguerreotype, and he took pictures of these elements of the buildings, and then they would come back to the office, and the next year's buildings would appear with these elements in them. This is a picture of Cram in the mid-left with his wife behind, and his mother on the right. That's Sarah Blake Cram on the right-hand side, and all the grandchildren clustered around. And this is taken at the family farm in Hampton Falls. This is a photograph of some of the work that Cram was doing at Princeton at the time. This is the Campbell Hall, which is a dormitory. It shows the influence of the Oxford influence on Cram. When he went to Magdalen College and he came back, he brought a lot of those ideas to his work at Princeton. And this was with the interest and the encouragement of the Princeton administration, because they wanted to convert Princeton into a first-class institution of learning, world-class institution, and the model that they looked up to for that was Oxford. So they really wanted not only to model the buildings on Oxford, but also to model the curriculum and the education, and so they did that. This is a major church in Chicago. Just run through a few quick buildings of Cram. This is Fourth Presbyterian Church. Cram did 7 or 8 major Presbyterian churches, culminating with the church in Pittsburgh for the Mellon family, East Liberty. This church is still there, a very prominent church in Chicago. They did mausoleums. This is a mausoleum for the Gale family in Troy, in a cemetery in Troy, New York, which we have been actually working on repairing and restoring, a Gothic mausoleum. He also designed the Japanese garden at the Museum of Fine Arts, and I remember when I was a kid, my mother took me there many times. Every time we went to the MFA, we would go and see the Japanese garden. It's no longer there, unfortunately, but this is a wonderful photograph of it. He also wrote a very important book on Japanese art and architecture, which is still in print. It was, interestingly, still in print. This is a drawing of St. Elizabeth of Hungary, who was the patron saint of St. Elizabeth's Chapel. And I don't know how this relates to St. Elizabeth's, but I believe it was the drawing that became the model for the statue that is there. Yeah, I don't know that either, but I think I found this in the firm archives without any, as with most of the things that I found in the firm archives, with very little explanatory text to go along with it. But that brings us to the time period of St. Elizabeth's. Around 1911, Cram had attained enough financial security. I should mention, by the way, that he was living in Beacon Hill. He lived on Chestnut Street in Beacon Hill. That was his primary residence. He had become a true Bostonian after attaining some degree of success, and his office was always in the Back Bay. So by 1911, though, he had earned enough money that he could make an investment in a 206-acre, I think, farm here in Sudbury, which was where, at the time, had been a stagecoach inn, and he bought the inn and started to stay there during the summers. And actually, there are some people in this audience who know even more about that building than I do, but I will just tell you the part that I've discovered from the firm archives. This photograph is one of Cram's daughters, and I think it's Elizabeth, putting the final stone on the gable of St. Elizabeth's Chapel, which was going to be the family church at their summer farm. So by 1913, he had attained a level of affluence that he could have his own personal chapel, and it was as you know, quite a substantial personal chapel. But it also always was in their mind that it would be a place where their neighbors could come and worship as well, and it was always open to the other people in the town. Interestingly, the chapel was built all with hand tools and with medieval methods, and you see the centering for one of the great arches there on the ground in the front, and you see the very crude sort of hoist up on the top, which they used to hoist the stones up to the top of the gable, and of course very, very crude methods. And here's another view of the chapel just about at the point that the walls were being completed. This is a picture of the consecration day of the chapel, and unfortunately we don't really know who the clerics are, but they were certainly members of the Cowley Monastery there, and I don't know who the specific ones are. I don't know if anyone else here does, but we do see Cram's son on the left-hand side there. And then a contemporary picture of how the chapel looked from with the pathway that they had constructed. This is here we see the statue of St. Elizabeth of Hungary and one of Cram's daughters there with it. And it probably is Mary. It looks like it to me as well, yeah. And here is everyone fully arrayed. Cram in the center with the glasses, his wife to the left, to his left, and his son, Ralph Adams Cram Jr. With them there. And you see here the workman who actually built the building on the left. And I don't know the specific clerics who are here. And then a contemporary picture of the interior. It really looks very much like it does today. This is the picture that we had in our archives. And then this is the chapel today. About the same time, Cram was doing another project called All Saints Peterborough, which would develop into probably one of his most beautiful churches and one of his most iconic churches. This is a picture of him with the donor, who is Mrs. Cheney, who was the daughter of B.P. Cheney, who was a very important railroad magnate at the time and started the American Express Company, actually. And she was she gave the chapel in memory of her son, who was killed in World War I. And actually, World War I was a horrible, had a horrible impact on so many families at the time. Many families lost at least one child in the war, and the Cheneys lost a child. The gentleman the young architect who designed the front door, which you'll see the hinges on the front door of St. Elizabeth's, was also killed in World War I as well. And this is a picture of All Saints in Peterborough as it is today. This is a nice little piece from our archive. This is a note from Bertram Goodhue to Ralph Adams Cram. In 1914, the split that had started in 1907 and 1908 with St. Thomas's finally got to a point where they couldn't really stay together any longer. Goodhue felt and wrote many times to Cram that Cram was being given credit for all of the work. It was all coming out as it was Cram's work, even in the cases where Goodhue was clearly the author of the work. Even in the cases where the work was being entirely almost done in New York, it was usually publicized as the work of Cram, Goodhue, and Ferguson, and Goodhue was not really mentioned enough. But this is kind of an interesting note because what it says is, "Dear RAC, we worked together so many years and fought together so many things. Dragons, Philistines, clients, and such like. Some at times, some another, that I'm sure you'll be lenient with me with pictures gathered within these years. With best wishes for a Merry Christmas, always yours, Bertram Goodhue." And what's interesting, there are two interesting things. Why did Goodhue have to write this note? Because Cram wouldn't give him photographs of the buildings. Even after he had left the office, even though he had worked on them, he was holding back and not being very supportive. And Goodhue's signature. It's modest, isn't it? So when Cram says that they were two insistent egos, we know exactly what he means. And that's a good evidence of that. Here's another Boston project that Cram did. This is the Gould Steps, Guild Steps. Guild or Gould? Gould, it's Gould Steps, right next to the Gould statue, the Gould monument. Cram designed the steps from the common up to the monument in that location. And this is his own rendering. You can see his, we actually have the original of this in the office. I don't know why I have this in black and white. It's in color. But you can see his monogram at the base of the steps on the right. At the base of the lamp standard on the right-hand side is RAC. It's his monogram. And that appears on some of the earlier renderings that he did. Not all, unfortunately, but on some. This is a much later rendering that he did for Wheaton. This is the chapel at Wheaton College in Norton, Mass. I included this to show yet another complete direction, eclectic direction that they took. Cram really wasn't a big part of this, but most of the collegiate work that they did by far was what was called colonial. And this is a good example of colonial. And what they meant by colonial was British here. It wasn't, you know, anything else. It wasn't American. It was definitely British in the United States. And this is, of course, a Wren church, Christopher Wren design here. And that's particularly ironic because Cram came out of the Pugin tradition, which was very scathing in its criticism of Wren and the English Renaissance architects. So it's really kind of incredible that a whole large part of the firm's work for many years was work that was English Renaissance, colonial in nature. But it was one of the things that happens to architects, and that is that the clients demand certain things. If the client demands it, the client gets it. This is a building at Williams College. Dick isn't here today, but Dick Clinton is a Williams alumnus, and he's very aware of Cram's contribution to that school. They did about 7 or 8 buildings there, several of the dormitories. This was the original library, and it's a great building to put in here because the original library they outgrew the library, even though our firm actually did an addition to the library in the 60s. Very shortly after that, Benjamin Thompson designed a new library for Williams College, which was absolutely hated by everyone forever, to the point that they are moving out of that building and putting the library back in here and adding more space to this building. So, enough said. In the 1920s, after World War I was over, Cram was, of course, a good friend of Woodrow Wilson's, knew quite a few members of the general staff, knew Pershing personally, and he was appointed as one of a number of architects who were designers of the battlefield monuments in Europe and in the American battlefields. And this particular one is the battlefield at Belleau Wood, which was a very important Marine battle. It was Pershing's headquarters, and it was the site where I think at least about 5,000 U.S. Marines were killed in one battle in this location. And all of their names are inscribed in the interior of the monument. It was a very moving monument. And here you see a postcard showing the monument as it was finished. The 20s, of course, it was the lead up to the crash. It was a great time of growing wealth in the United States, and another fire afforded an opportunity for the office. At Princeton, their chapel burned to the ground mysteriously one night. It was never known how it happened, but it was a very interesting time in American educational institutions. Most of the American colleges and universities had started as outgrowths of churches, whether it was the Presbyterians or the Methodists. It was Methodist at BU, Presbyterian at Princeton. Catholics, of course, still have many churches, many colleges and universities that are affiliated with the Catholic Church. A lot of the other mainline denominational institutions have downplayed their connection with their founding denomination, but partly because around the mid-1920s we had a tremendous secularization going on in the United States, and there was a big question about why even at Princeton whether there should be a chapel at all, because the fact that it had burned down seemed a great opportunity to quite a few people to just not have one at all, because what do we need it for? And the administration at the college thought that they indeed did still need to have a chapel, and Cram was one of the writers who defended the idea that a chapel had a place in the modern university. And of course, he designed this this is very beautiful. I think the second most beautiful building that they did was the Princeton Chapel. It's absolutely stunning. Based on a King's or Queen's Chapel, depending on, it has elements of King's Chapel and Queen's Chapel at Oxford and Cambridge that you can see if you study it. It also shows the growing influence of French architecture on Cram. You see the Gallery of Kings, which is something that is really kind of a prominent French idea here at the top, going across the top. They also did Romanesque work at that time. This is a Romanesque Catholic church, actually. And then another church that's very close to us here and also very beautiful is St. George's Chapel in Newport, Rhode Island at St. George's School. And this church was begun in 1923. It was completed in 1929. It was the work, it was paid for by John Nicholas Brown. He started the work in his third year at Harvard and worked very closely with Cram, who had been the architect for his parents' house and for a number of churches for his mother. And the result was that Cram and Brown worked together and designed this church together over quite a long time, over 6 years. And it cost almost $1 million in 1929, which is quite a spectacular sum at that time. And this is the interior. You can see one of the distinguishing things about this church is it has a true masonry ceiling. And this church is open. You can go and stop at the school and walk right in. You're welcome to visit it. It's a very beautiful chapel. Around, I'm not sure exactly when, but late 20s, Cram sold his house at Beacon Hill and actually moved to Whitehall and started to spend more time at Whitehall. And this photograph is an interesting photograph because I think most of what you see here is no longer at Whitehall. You can see that there are quite extensive formal gardens there, really quite beautiful, and trees, and all of that I think is now disappeared. You can see how beautiful it was. And because this porch is the porch you see coming along Concord Road as you look up. This was a rose arbor that was there at one time as well, and I don't know the exact location. I think it was on the other side of the house. It's behind the house. Is it still there?
Well, Fletcher Steele designed all the gardens.
Yes,
They were going to restore it. This is the only thing that's left of Fletcher Steele.
Yeah. Thank you. This picture is actually in the book. This is a family portrait. I don't know what the occasion was. I only know that this is all of the Cram, of course. Here you see Cram, his wife, and then I think that's her sister right next to him, and his brother-in-law, Eggleston, is down below, and I don't know who the rest of them are. But it does give you a sense of what Sunday at the Crams was like. It was actually called Cram-a-Lot by his friends. And here we have another picture of the gardens and a picture of one of his daughters in the garden. And all these photographs were in our archive. Another great church that he did about this time, which I put in because I just gave a talk there, a book talk. It's the American Church in Paris. It's a very interesting church also because it's a non-denominational church, the only one of its kind that he did. I wasn't fully aware that that was the case, but it seemed amazing that he would be chosen for such a church, and also that it would be so Catholic looking in the end. But of course it makes perfect sense. It's Cram, it's Paris, it's France, you know. Very beautiful church as well. And stepping back one step, in 1911, Cram was appointed as the consulting architect for the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York. Those of you, I'm sure lots of you know the St. John the Divine story. It was begun in the 1880s. Cram actually submitted a competition design for it, as did many other young architects, wasn't chosen. Hines and Lafarge were chosen as the architects, and during the, well, many things happened. Among them, they found very poor soil in the building site. J.P. Morgan actually had to step in and give the cathedral a big pile of money to try to help them get out of their foundation problems because the hole had to be so much deeper. So many things happened along the way to really throw up roadblocks to this building, and one of them was that the architect who was largely responsible for the initial design died before very much of it could be built. Only the very beginning of the choir had actually been built. And Cram stepped into the breach. It's said, and the legend is that he was on a boat to Europe on one of his many trips to Europe, and the bishop was there too at that time, and it was a one-week journey, and by the end of the journey, Cram had converted him to being a complete medievalist, and they had decided to turn the church to a Gothic church from the original Romanesque design. This was not taken as very happily by a lot of people. It was not taken happily by Goodhue, who felt that Cram was kind of horning in on his territory. And it was not taken very well by the profession, many of whom tried to convince Cram to give up this commission because they felt it was unethical for him to take it away from the partner of the original architect. Cram was on the ethical board of the AIA at the time, so it was a very tough decision for him to make, I'm sure. But he decided to stay with the commission. And in the 1920s, this photograph shows that by 1921 or 2, the cathedral authorities realized that they were not going to finish the building before Cram died. And so they decided to hire him to go ahead and finish the design, even though they really didn't have the money to build the rest of the building. So he worked for 6 years, from 1925 to 1931, on completing the designs for the cathedral. And he completed a good portion of it. There are parts of it that are not finished yet, but he did complete the overall design, and this is the final central tower scheme. The tower is not built. The transepts are not built, and the two west towers are still not built. So they only have about $500 million ahead of them. This is a passport picture. Another thing that turned up in the firm archives was passports. It shows Cram's signature, and this is about 1925 or 6 with a stamp showing he had been to Portugal. Very important because in 1926 he went to Spain. And that was the first time for someone who had traveled everywhere, had been to Turkey, had been to Constantinople, been to all over Europe. He had never been to Spain. And he lamented after going there the fact that he had waited so long to go, because so many Spanish buildings have been preserved over all the years from the medieval period, where in most of the other countries of Europe they've been destroyed, either through the French Revolution in France, through the Reformation in England and in Germany and other places. So Cram felt very happy that he could find so many Gothic monuments that were so still preserved at that time. One that he mentioned in his autobiography was the Cathedral of Palma de Mallorca, on the island of Mallorca, and one of the Balearic Islands in the Mediterranean. And he felt that this was a wonderful example, and he used many ideas from his Spanish trip in the remaining years of his life. And some of the ideas were based on Palma de Mallorca, primarily his completion of St. John the Divine. You see here how the aisles in Palma de Mallorca are all the way to the ceiling. They're not a lowered aisle form, and from that he got the idea to do the same thing at St. John the Divine, which allowed him to incorporate the buttresses into the roofs of the aisles, which was much less expensive and more practical for the New York climate than flying buttresses would have been. He also received other commissions that where he used his Spanish knowledge, and one of them was the Church of St. Vincent de Paul in Los Angeles for Mrs. Doheny, who was one of the partners in Standard Oil, the Doheny family. And they commissioned Cram in 1920, end of the 1920s, I'm not sure the exact date, to design the interior of this church. And he designed it all, and it was a Romanesque church, and the whole interior is designed in a very strong Spanish style. So it was kind of his last foray into another style. And here you see it's extremely decorative, almost in a Spanish Renaissance. And this is one of the drawings from that project. While in Spain, he also visited Seville, and he saw the tower at Sevilla, which is actually a minaret, because both in Sevilla and Cordoba, the mosques, the original mosques, were taken over by the Catholic kings when they threw the Muslims out of the Spanish peninsula, the Iberian Peninsula. They chased them all the way down to Granada. Granada was the last great battle, and after the fall of Granada, the Muslims had to leave and go to North Africa. And so when the Catholics took over, they built cathedrals in the middles of these mosques, and it's the most amazing thing to see today when you go there and you see what you know is a mosque, and it crosses all over it, and it's just fantastic. You know, the clash of cultures is just incredible. In the Cordoba Mosque, if you haven't been there, it's an absolute must today, because it's so timely right now. When you think about the clash of culture that we have with Christian-oriented culture or Judeo-Christian based culture and Islamic culture, you really see it in Spain right now. It's incredible because you have these monuments there, and the last time I was there, there were 4 or 5 young Arabic-looking guys who wanted to go in the mosque, and the guards were giving them a really hard time about going in, and they were saying, "You can't pray. You cannot pray." They wouldn't, and they said, "We see you praying, we're going to throw you out." And this is today. This is right now. And the reason is that they are still having that clash of culture in Spain. And we know also that they had a really serious problem as a result of that not too long ago. But Cram went there, and he saw Islamic culture, and with the antiquarian eye and the eye that he had, with his appreciation for culture in general, he thought how interesting it was that there were so many elements of Islamic architecture that had been adopted by the Christians over the years. And he wrote several books about the progress of Christianity and how Christianity had made its way from Jerusalem to Egypt to Syria and eventually to Italy, and along this path had picked up things like the OG Arch, which was not a part of the culture in Europe until it was brought there from the Islamic countries. So Cram was, of course, very fascinated by this melding of culture that had happened over those many years, and he actually, I think, used it at East Liberty Presbyterian. And it's really doubly funny because the Mrs. Mellon, you know, had asked him, and there's a record of this conversation where she had asked him, "Is this building, you know, Gothic enough?" And he had said, "This is so Gothic you won't be able to sleep at night." But actually, if you look at it, you know, it has some very powerful resemblance to that minaret there in Sevilla too. And of course, he'd been to Sevilla not too long before that. So I just think that Cram is a fascinating character because of his appreciation and how he brings these things together. This is the final design for the West Towers at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, and a couple more pictures of it. This is another passport picture of Cram, his wife, and his daughter. And I believe the reason she has a big X across her face is because she came of age and had been removed from the passport, but and then the last real project that he did here in this area, which is the Cowley Chapel, which was financed by Isabella Stewart Gardner. It was one of her great gifts to us here. And this chapel also, you should go and see if you have the chance. It's certainly one of the most beautiful interiors that you can see. And this is the interior of that chapel. It's entirely in blue granite from this area. And the beams were actually salvaged from a bridge that was being taken down at the time. So it really brings together a lot of different ideas about preservation and keeping things and continuation and recycling. You know, in 1938, they were thinking that way. This is in right by Harvard Yard on Memorial Drive. So as you're going down Store Drive and you look to the left toward Harvard, you'll see it. The monastery is right there next to Harvard. And here's a picture of Cram and what do they call those things? In front of the door to St. Elizabeth's Chapel, and of course with the beautiful hinges that were done by Samuel Yellen, who made the hinges, and the architect Dean who designed them in his office. And Cram and his wife. Actually, a very serene, beautiful picture. One of his daughters, I think it was Mary, moved to New Mexico. And she was part of an artist colony in New Mexico for many years. And they went to see her a number of times, and this is one of the photographs on one of those trips. And we're getting now toward the end of his life. I think this is the oldest picture that we have of him. Just a little plug, this is the design that I did for the Memorial Garden next to the chapel. The idea was to have two small sort of memorial structures there, and that was what won the award, the design for these. And this here, of course, is Cram's grave, he and his wife, and beyond the children. He planted the trees that formed the circle personally around, that are still there. He really planned this to be his memorial, and it's quite a fitting memorial. We have built the Memorial Garden beyond that now, so I was standing in the Memorial Garden taking that photograph. And at the very end, this is the last thing, I wanted to show you a building that we're doing now. Ursula mentioned it. This is the monastery called Sion Abbey, and it's being built. It's almost finished, I think just about finished now. It's near Roanoke, Virginia. It's on the Blue Ridge Parkway, right on the edge of the ridge. The ground drops off 900 feet right behind it. You can see right there. So it's literally right on the top of the mountain on the edge. You can see it from the whole valley. It's just a spectacular sight. And it's for a Benedictine house, and the abbot did his seminary in England at a monastery in England, and although he's from Massachusetts originally, was very much in love with English architecture and wanted an English style, English medieval style church and monastery, but particularly one that would be Catholic in its orientation. And of course, they found out about the Cram firm, and they called us saying, do you still do that type of thing? I said, are you kidding? So this is the result of that effort. And you see on this side, this is, of course, approaching the monastery from the drive with some grouse in the way. This is Father John's vineyard. And there you see how it really looks. And This, the chapel is entirely masonry construction with no steel, and it has true wood timber trusses holding up the roof. It also is clad entirely on the outside in Spanish limestone, which we drew and designed here in the U.S. and then had fabricated in Spain, and it was shipped here in containers. So there are about 40 containers of Spanish limestone in this building, both inside and out. And the rest of it is in stucco. And that's the interior of their chapel with their rose window. And their French bells. They've been very fortunate. They've had people come and donate bells and donate the windows, and it's just come together beautifully. And this is, of course, the bells going in. And that's the bells ringing. That's Father John ringing the bells. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ethan. I would like to say we have time for questions, but it is getting late, and we know people have brought their books to be signed also. So if you don't mind, Ethan, maybe if you could just stay and informally answer questions and also sign some of the books that are here. And don't forget, we have books back there. And please, we have a ton of refreshments. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you.